So they sent in who? The Filipinos? Well, how did it go? 10 points for the Filipinos. You forget they're here sometimes. That's not good. Yeah. All right. May 26, 1952. Over the course of the war, we've seen the field actions of troops from a variety of UN nations. Turks, the Dutch, Canadians, the Belgians, and many more. And this week, the Filipinos go into action. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week came a series of allegations by the communists that the U.S. has been engaging in bacteriological warfare, based on the forced confessions of captured airmen. There was fallout from the Koje-Do POW drama 2 weeks ago, and Mark Clark settled in as new UN commander. There's still plenty of fallout, repercussions, and echoes from the goings-on at Koje-Do, when prisoners kidnapped the camp commandant, General Francis Dodd, and managed to get a few demands agreed to for his release. In Busan, at POW enclosure number 2 for hospital cases, there are 3,500 men remaining among the patients and work details of compounds 1, 2, and 3 that have not yet been screened to see if they would violently resist repatriation to North Korea or China after an armistice. John Bostic, the camp commandant, wants to prevent any group actions like at Koje-Do. So he tells the prisoners that food and water is only available in the new segregated quarters after screening. Compound 3 tries to negotiate conditions under which they'll allow themselves to be screened, but Bostic won't talk with them. Compounds 1 and 2 just sort of ignore him and the 2 infantry battalions he has in position around the compounds. Well, they ignore them that night, which was actually back on the 11th. The next day, the 12th, they sing patriotic songs, wave flags and signs, and though the infantry fixes bayonets and a couple of tanks turn up, no one tries to go in and start screening, and the prisoners don't come out. That night, Compound 3 sets up sandbags, although there is no violence. On the 13th, loudspeakers blare the UN orders and offers of hot food and cigarettes in the new compounds, but no takers. On the 14th, some rocks are thrown at the guards and a few shots ring out, but nothing major happens to end the standoff. Compound 1 says, "Can we talk to some people from the Red Cross?" U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet says, "Sure, they can interview you." And the other 2 compounds want to do that too. So that happens, but still no one is ready to obey Bostic's orders. On the 15th, Paul Yount from 2nd Logistical Command gets Van Fleet's approval to shift the focus from screening to control, with the unregistered POWs to remain unregistered until there is an armistice settlement at Panmunjom. After this, a settlement is reached with Compound 1, and without screening, the prisoners peacefully go to their new compound. However, any hopes the other 2 compounds would follow suit were soon dashed, so on the 19th, Van Fleet authorizes force to clear them. There is a morning announcement that this is the last chance for them to obey, and then the infantry is sent into Compound 3. The prisoners resist, armed with stones, knives, sharpened tent poles, whatever they can get their hands on, and the infantry uses tear gas and concussion grenades. They herd the prisoners together and then force them to the new compounds. 1 prisoner is killed and 29 more wounded, and 1 American is wounded. Compound 2 evidently takes a lesson from this action, because on the 21st, they allow the infantry to move them without incident. Since the kidnapping of General Dodd, screening has taken a backseat to the issue of security. Van Fleet really prioritizes getting full control back in all the POW camps. Last week, his staff did a study of things, and on the 16th sent him 3 alternatives to get it. The first is simply remove all prisoners from Korea. The second is to disperse them all over Korea, and the third is to do both, remove some from the country and spread the others out. Van Fleet actually prefers the first one. I mean, if all POWs held were out of the country, 8th Army would not have any rear security issues like Koje-Do, and he could concentrate on his primary mission of fighting the war. Alternative 3 would at least lessen the problem too. Dispersal around Korea would allow for better control, but would also require more administrative and logistical work and security personnel. UN Commander Mark Clark, however, does not want any of the POWs taken out of the country, so he tells Van Fleet, get busy with Alternative 2, just dispersal. He's happy to send in the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team to help out and tank support if necessary. So, what is Van Fleet's plan then? Well, there will be new enclosures on the islands Koje-Do and Jeju-Do, and he wants 22 enclosures on the mainland, each holding just 4,000 POWs. Compounds in the enclosures would be strictly limited to 500 men each, with concertina wire and double fencing between them for real separation. When the new camps were finished, Van Fleet was going to try to use the prisoners' representatives to induce them to move voluntarily. But if resistance developed, as he expected it would, food and water would be withheld, and the prisoners would receive these only at the new compounds. As a last resort, he would employ force. Both Clark and his superiors agree that although the plan might incur unfavorable publicity and had to be handled carefully, the communist control of Koje-Do had to be broken. They recommend to Van Fleet that he use Red Cross assistance as much as possible, and that personnel from other UN countries involved in Korea be added to that at Koje-Do. The Netherlands battalion is actually already there, and he'll send a Greek, a British, and a Canadian company over. Moving the prisoners is going to be a difficult job, and Van Fleet decides that U.S. 2nd Division Assistant Commander Bull Boatner is the man for it, and makes him the new commandant of Koje-Do. Boatner moves 6,000 civilians off the island, then starts working his men in 12-hour shifts to build the smaller, stronger new enclosures. You know what? Another word or three about Boatner, actually, which I read in T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War. He went to Tokyo for R&R, and back on the 11th was sitting in the Tokyo main PX when he was paged and told to go to General Headquarters, the Daiichi. There he got the news from the assistant G1, personnel officer, that he's been assigned to Koje-Do. This is literally the day after General Dodd is released by his captors, so it's in all the papers. He asks how he can get out of it, and is told he can't. And furthermore, a plane is going to take him there in an hour. Before that, he is to see Mark Clark, the new FECOM commander, who's taking over right during all the Koje-Do hoo-ha. Clark was absolutely flabbergasted by what had happened at Koje-Do. He told Boatner he felt the American army had been disgraced. He had just visited the island with the departing Ridgway, and he had been horrified at the lack of discipline and control over the rioting POWs. Boatner tells him the way things are there, it will take bloodshed to restore control. Clark says he expects that and supports him. Boatner is a smart guy, so he asks for a law officer who is thoroughly familiar with the Geneva Conventions, and Clark says he will get one. Then Boatner goes to Clark's Chief of Staff Doyle Hickey and tells him of his talk with Clark, and makes sure he understands that Boatner has been authorized to use violence. Then goes to the next two guys down the command list, Generals Shepard and Ryan, to make sure they too are on record that Boatner has been so authorized. I will talk more about Boatner and how he plans to sort out things over the next few weeks. I mentioned last week that the Coulson letter to the POWs who kidnapped Dodd answering their demands had an effect on the goings-on at Panmunjom, where the peace talks have been held for many months. Now, the UN delegates submitted a peace package, supposedly the UN's final one, April 28th, and they didn't pay much attention to the Dodd thing at first when it happened a week and a half later, since they were busy trying to convince the other side that it is not just an interim position, but a real final offer. However, when the letter came out, they really began to learn the impact of the incident. For the enemy, the riots at Koje-Do and the Coulson letter provided a custom-made weapon to discredit the basic stand of the United Nations command on the only issue that remained, repatriation. The communists eagerly seized the opportunity to weaken the UNC position in the eyes of the world, and in the process too, strengthen their own case of the repatriation of all prisoners of war. The repatriation issue really is the only thing standing in the way of an armistice just now after the past few weeks, since the net result of the peace proposal eliminated the airfield rebuilding issue and the USSR being on any supervisory committee issue. Thing is, when it was given, former UN Commander Matt Ridgway wanted strong backing from both Washington and the other UN nations fighting in Korea. He wanted everyone to issue strong, blunt statements telling the communists that this really was the final offer. However, neither the State Department, the military bigwigs, nor the UN allies would go quite that far. They'll issue messages of support and things that imply that it's a final offer, but no ultimatums. If the talks break off, they still all want it to be the fault of the communist side. The communists were holding firm that they wanted to exchange the 12,000 military POWs they hold for the 132,000 the UN holds in an all-for-all exchange. Ridgway and UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy thought there was no longer any reason for holding executive sessions. Back on the 6th, Joy told NAM Aldis, and they agreed to go back to open sessions. This had no effect whatsoever on the proceedings, but of course a few days later came the General Dodd incident. On the 16th, NAM had this to say at the plenary conference.
As long as your side does not change this peremptory attitude and give up your unreasonable proposal, our side will continue to expose at these conferences the absurdity of your proposal. The so-called screening is totally absurd and impermissible. The so-called result of your so-called screening is doubly absurd and wholly concocted by your side. The commandant of your prisoner of war camp has already declared to the whole world the utter bankruptcy of your proposition.
A few moments later.
The unshakable fact is that our captured personnel would rather die than yield to your design of retaining them as your cannon fodder. The unshakable fact is that public confessions of your commandant of your prisoner of war camp have killed and buried the myth that our captured personnel refused to be repatriated. In spite of all your threats and violence, our captured personnel rose in heroic and just resistance against your forced screening. The commandant of your prisoner of war camp could not but confess before the whole world your inhumane treatment and murderous violence against our captured personnel, and the criminal and unlawful acts committed by your side in screening and rearming war prisoners by force.
I have to say, the damage done to the UN stance on screening and repatriation is pretty considerable globally. They can't really say much to refute NAM, and the communists begin taking things further, making new charges, like NAM charges that UN planes bombed a communist POW camp, injuring a number of their own troops who were POWs there. He tells Joy that the very next day, supply trucks heading for Panmunjom were strafed. The UN is able to deny most of these new charges, but they are kept on the defensive by the relentless accusations. Hey, this week, Turner Joy's time as chief UN delegate comes to its end. For real. On May 22nd, he gives a speech of his own, his farewell speech. It's partly quoted in that Walter Hermes book. Joy managed to strike back at the enemy, recalling that on the 10th of July 1951, he had stressed that the success or failure of the negotiations begun here today depends directly upon the good faith of the delegations present. He pointed out that hope had proven to be forlorn. The communists had cavilled over procedural matters, manufactured spurious issues, denied agreements, and indulged in abuse and invective when all else failed, the admiral charged. Comparing the records of the two sides, he noted that they are as different as night and day. No amount of propaganda, however oft repeated, can hide your ignoble record. Joy urged the acceptance of the package proposal, then concluded, "After 10 months and 12 days, I feel there is nothing more for me to do. There is nothing left to negotiate. I now turn over the unenviable job of further dealings with you to Major General William K. Harrison, who succeeds me as Senior Delegate of the United Nations Command Delegation. May God be with him." Joy has done a pretty good job showing a good deal of restraint, and they have sorted every issue except the one of repatriation. And let's face it, the discussions on that are over as well. One side or the other will have to concede for an armistice to be signed. That's it. Joy is well aware of that, but that deadlock is not his responsibility. There are other personnel changes at the talks too. Harrison taking over means Frank McConnell takes over as Army Rep. On the other side, Lee Han Lim takes over from Yoo Chae-hyung as ROK Rep. ROK is South Koreans. All changes are personnel of lower rank taking over from superior officers, perhaps because there is not a whole lot for them to do, really. It's not just the North Koreans and the Chinese that the UN has issues with, though. I mentioned 2 months ago that Matt Ridgway and U.S. Ambassador to Korea John Muccio wanted to send a high-level mission over from D.C. to really try to sort out the South Korean-UNC relations, which, as we've seen, have grown more and more strained over the past months. Clarence Meyer was named chief of that mission. Well, this week comes the result of the mission. On the 24th, an agreement is signed between the Unified Command and the ROK. When you think of how much has been talked about national sovereignty and all the political and economic turmoil this year so far, it's a pretty fair deal. A combined economic board is set up with one UN and one ROK member to promote economic cooperation or effective coordination. This board will make binding recommendations on the use of all foreign exchange and will integrate this into UN assistance programs. Remember, the ROC really did not want the UN controlling its foreign exchange, but Ridgway had wanted at least some control of it in exchange for the huge monthly payments the UN was making. As for those payments, those won advances, won as the local currency, the UNC agrees that all advances from January 1st, 1952 to May 31st shall be settled at the rate of 6,000 won to the dollar. Older claims from 1950 and 1951 are deferred to some later date, and claims for future months after this one will be paid at a more realistic rate than 6,000 to 1, which would likely be more than twice that. They basically agree to pay $75 million for January through May. 10% of the advances each month will be written off as the ROK contribution to the war effort. The ROK government also agrees to take measures to control inflation, and the UN will try and get won out of the market by bringing in as much stuff to sell as possible. If both sides made sincere efforts to carry out the terms of this agreement, the economic situation in Korea could improve considerably in the near future. Whether this might also have a favorable influence upon the political and armistice problems was another matter. By May 1952, the armistice negotiations had again reached a stalemate, and ROK agitation against the truce had subsided, but President Rhee's internal conflict with his fellow politicians threatened to build up into another crisis. In any case, the UN command might only have adjusted the economic differences in time to be dragged into the political arena, but at least one thorn in the ROC-UNC relations had been amicably removed. There is field action this week at Hill Erie. Last week, the 20th Philippine Battalion Combat Team launched a series of raids against the Chinese in the region. This week on the 21st, the Filipinos prepare their final assault on the PVA Chinese positions. It is the 2nd Recon Platoon, 44 men, who get the call. They are led by a young second lieutenant named Fidel Ramos. That name seems like the kind of name the president of the Philippines might one day have, decades from now. Anyhow, Ramos splits his force into 4 groups, and they head out just after 4 a.m., crawling through rice paddies for a couple hours until they reach an irrigation ditch. This is like 400 meters from the crest of the hill, and they wait while half a dozen or so Sabre jets hit the Chinese position with napalm, and then the artillery softens them up too. After that, Ramos's guys find a hole in the barbed wire and occupy the front part of the enemy trench network. Scattered close quarters fighting follows, and the Filipinos gain the upper hand over the disorganized Chinese. A sniper team holds off enemy support from another nearby hill. By 7:30 a.m., the Chinese bunkers have been destroyed on Erie, and the Filipinos withdraw so that tanks can blast the position. Ramos's men suffer 1 injury, while the Chinese take casualties estimated in the hundreds, mainly from the airstrikes, artillery, napalm, and tank blasts. And there, I will leave you for this week of the war, as does Turner Joy, with POW issues still dictating the course of the war and success for the Philippine Battalion. Here's a little more about Bull Boatner and the Olsson letter to end today. After Boatner is told of his new posting, he first goes to Busan and then to Koje-Do, where he meets the whole cast of characters I mentioned the past couple weeks. Paul Yount from 2nd Logistical Command, Frank Dodd, of course, and finally Charlie Colson, who was sent in to sort out the situation when Dodd was kidnapped. It turns out Colson is totally unaware that his actions are under scrutiny from above in both Tokyo and Washington. Boatner, though, has just been in the thick of the Tokyo media frenzy, and he tells him Mark Clark is mad as hell at him And Coulson asks, why? Boatner says, because of the agreement he made with the communist POWs. Coulson says, well, Clark approved it. How can he be mad about it? Boatner is stunned and asks if Coulson can prove that, and Coulson says, sure. He's got the stenographic notes of their conversation. He has them right here. Boatner says, they don't officially prove Clark's approval, but Coulson better bring them with him to Tokyo, because he's in big trouble. T.R. Fehrenbach writes, it was certain that Charlie Coulson never realized he was under any criticism or fire whatever, and whatever this said for his judgment, many people, including Bull Boatner, regarded his subsequent demotion to colonel and retirement to verge on the criminal. In democratic societies, as well as totalitarian, it never pays to embarrass the powers that be. Hey, you know what you should do? You should join the Time Ghost Army. And if you do that, then we get to continue making stuff like this. It's that simple. To do so, go to timeghost.tv. Yeah, timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers in the Army, and Matthew Edgar is the Army Member of the Week here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.